Today's daf we're going to be learning is Chullin, daf Pei Gimel. Today's daf is sponsored by Judy Schwartz in honor of her daughter Rina. To my incredible daughter Rina, thankful for who you are and for having started me on my daf journey with Hadran. Mazal tov. Okay, we're going to start with a few short announcements. Tomorrow is Tisha B'Av, so as I mentioned, Tisha B'Av generally is customary not to learn Torah, except for things that are specifically related to Tisha B'Av, so we will basically be not having regular class, but I will put up the daf right after class today, and you can get ahead if you would like. That's first of all. Secondly, after Friday will be our last day of Zoom for a while. We will start back on Zoom on August 30th. I will be away, but the shiurim will go up as usual on time when they should be going up. They'll also be up earlier than usual, as is what happens when I'm away. The third thing is I will be speaking in Teaneck on August 16th. So if anybody's around, I'll be teaching at Rina Israel. So if anyone's around on Sunday, August 16th, at 6:15 in the evening. Okay? So if you're looking for more details, you can reach out to us, or hopefully you'll get it. We'll send out details. We don't have flyers yet, but they will go around before. Okay, so now we're going to get started with our daf. We were trying to figure out, we had the opinion of Sumchos, and Sumchos said, if you remember, slaughter the grandmother, the granddaughter, and then afterwards you slaughter all on the same day, the middle generation, thereby transgressing two prohibitions of Oto V'Beno as relates to two different beings, right? We talked about Gufim Muchlakim. You're going to get 80 sets of lashes. So now we have a question about, we wanted to know, Abai said, what would he say when it's not Gufim Muchlakim? If it's, let's say, two pieces of chelev, behelem echad. So then we said, Rav Yosef said, yes, you're going to be chayav two according to Sumchos as well. And then the Gemara is in an attempt to try to find what is the proof for Rav Yosef for this. Where do we see Sumchos saying the following thing? And we keep bringing sources. We brought two different sources. We tried, right, each time we had to say, what exactly is the case? Could this prove Sumchos? Okay, but every time we reject it and say, no, this doesn't really prove it. And we're in the middle of a rejection right now, saying, no, this can't be Sumchos, and we're going back to an original, or it doesn't necessarily have to be. It could be. But they then go back to an original suggestion that they have rejected. We're talking about someone who eats a kizayit from each of the sides of the gid and asher, right? The sciatic nerve on the right, the sciatic nerve on the left. You're going to get 80. Rabbi Yehuda says you're going to get 40. And then we said, well, it can't be that you ate a bezar charzeu b'shtei atraot, because if, according to Rabbi Yehuda, you wouldn't even get 40 lashes because that's a hatrat safek. To which we now go back and reinstate that. And we say, no, you could explain that that's what happened. There were two warnings. That's why the rabbis say 80. Nothing having to do with Sumchos. And what about Rabbi Yehuda? Well, it goes by the other Rabbi Yehuda, meaning not a different Rabbi Yehuda, but a different opinion about what Rabbi Yehuda holds about Hatrat Safek. And we're going to see a source where it's not exactly clear, but they're going to try to infer from this source that he actually thinks that Hatrat Safek is a good warning. Okay, remember what Hatrat Safek is. It's when you give a warning that's not a definitive warning. So there's two reasons why it wouldn't be definitive. One is because it's not clear transgressing the prohibition. That was when you weren't sure if it was your father or not your father, or the gid and asher or not the gid and asher, because maybe it's the one that's forbidden, maybe it's not. Only the right is forbidden according to him. There could be another type of Hatrat Safek, which we discussed very recently, which is if you're not going to transgress the prohibition immediately, because you still have time to kind of not transgress it, as the case we're going to see right now, that's also Hatrat Safek. And here they're going to try to prove that Rabbi Yochanan Rabbi Yehuda holds on the other side of this debate and thinks it is valid. So, did Tanya, starting from the very end of Pei Bet Amud Bet, Lo totiru mimenu ad boker. This is the meat. You're not allowed to leave the meat of your sacrifice until the morning. Ve'hanotar mimenu ad boker. This is on Korban Pesach. Hanotar mimenu ad boker by eish tisrofu. What's left till the morning has to be burned. Now, you don't get lashes for this prohibition for various reasons. One of the reasons would be it's a hatrat safek, because if I tell you right now, it's nighttime, you're supposed to eat the Korban Pesach. If you leave it over till the morning, you're going to get punished. I tell you that sometime in the evening. Now, you're not going to immediately transgress that because you might not eat it that minute, but that's not necessarily transgressing it because you could still eat it later. So again, Hatrat Safek means also that it's not clear from the next minute that you're going to transgress this punishment, this offense. So if you basically, anytime someone's going to say, if you don't eat it, you're going to get punished, well, right, you'll get lashes, let's say. Okay, so I could say, I know, I'll eat later. Right? In other words, I could be ignoring the fact that I, in the end, don't eat isn't really connected to that warning I got a few hours ago or even a few minutes ago. So that's a hatrat safek. Now, if you want to say you don't get lashes because it's hatrat safek, right, that would be perfect. But Rabbi Yehuda, who we thought thinks that hatrat safek is not a warning, Rabbi Yehuda would say this is hatrat safek, and that's why you don't get lashes. But instead, he gives a different reason, and that's their proof that he must hold hatrat safek is a warning, and theoretically you could have gotten lashes for that reason, and you're not getting it for a different reason. Okay, so that's why it's not the best proof, because it could be he thinks that's another reason, and that this is just there's two reasons. It's not like he says a hatrat safek is a hatrat. It's just that would have been an easier answer to bring. So what does he explain? So Rabbi Yehuda explains here the reason you don't get lashes, again, is not because it's hatrat safek, but because there's an asset. This is the classic lavadi takla. We just talked about this 2 tapim ago, right? This is the classic use of it, which is there's a negative prohibition and then there's a positive way to fix it. Don't leave it over. If you did leave it over, you have to burn it. So that's a positive that goes with the negative, and you don't get lashes in a case like that. Rabbi Yaakov Omer, this already isn't related, but he's just telling us another reason. They're already in the middle of this breita. Rabbi Yaakov explains the reason is lo min Hashem hu zeh. It's not because of the reason you said, Rabbi Yehuda. There's a different reason why you're not obligated. That's because it's a lav that has a negative prohibition, that has no action associated with it. In order to get lashes, you have to do something. You have to do an action, transgress something. In this case, your transgression is lack of action. You didn't eat something. There's no actual action that we could say, you're going to get lashes for that action. It's just lack of action. You didn't do what you were supposed to, but you didn't do anything. Okay. Now we go to the third source, the third and final attempt to prove, Rav Yosef, who claimed that Sumchos would say the same thing even when it's not gufim muchlakim, like the chelev. So we're still in Gid HaNasheh now. Tashma, another source in Gid HaNasheh. We're going to get to all these soon when we get to the chapter of Gid HaNasheh. Achal shnei gidim mishtei reichot mishtei beimot. You ate 2 gidim, 2 sciatic nerves, from 2 thighs, from 2 different animals. Sofek shmonim, you're going to get 80 lashes. So obviously what we're going to try to do is connect this 80 lashes with Sumchos and try to say that we're talking about when you did it, right, in the Bevat Echad, and then it would be parallel. Rabbi Yehuda Omer, eno sofeg ela arba'in. Rabbi Yehuda says you only get 40. So hechidami, what's the case? Ilema, you should be familiar. This is what we've been doing with all the cases. Ilema bezer chazeu b'shtei atraot. If you ate the sciatic nerve and you were warned before, and then you were warned again before you ate the second one, and then you did it. Everyone would agree, my time de Rabbi Yehuda, damar arba'in v'tulo, right? Everyone agree 80. So why would Rabbi Yehuda say 40? Elapshita bevat echad ubachad hatra. It must be you did it bevat echad, all at once, and with one warning. Okay, and then we're going to see, the rabbis say shmonim because you did 2, right? They were not gufim muchlakim, they're just 2 gidim. It's like 2 pieces of chelev, and it was all under one warning, and that's why you're going to get double set, and that would prove by the chelev with the helem echad, you would have 2 chata'ot, 2 sin offerings. So now they're going to just prove that Tanakama must match Sumchos, because he certainly doesn't match the rabbis, and this should be familiar as well. Man Tanakama, who's Tanakama? Ilema Rabbanan, again, who says 80. If you're going to say it's the Rabbanan de Pligele de Sumchos, it matches the rabbi's opinion who disagree with Sumchos. Mahatam de Gufim Uchlakim Patre Rabbanan Notovet, but no, they said only 40. All the more so, Hachalo Koshkin, all the more so here, when we're not talking about 2 different beings, 2 different animals, right? This is, it happens to come from 2 animals, but we're talking about a sciatic nerve. It's not like an animal, a whole animal. So, Elalav Sumchos, it must be Sumchos, and there's your proof. But, just like all the others, we're going to reject this. We end up, unfortunately, with no answer to Rav Yosef. No proof. no conclusive proof. In other words, again, all of these attempts could be true. We just don't know because you could read them otherwise. Lo olam b'zeh achar zeh. You could say it was one after the other. Now, what was our problem with that? Utkamar tamai tamid Rabbi Yehuda. Why would Rabbi Yehuda say you get 40 and not 80? You could say the case was a case kegon de lepe kezayid. There wasn't, the sciatic nerve of each one was not an olive bulk. Now we're going to see in Perek Gid Asher, which we're going to quote right now, but we're going to see this inside there, which is there's a brayta detanya achlo ve'embo kezayid chayav Rabbi Yehuda Omer ad sheyebo kezayid. There's a machloket. What if you ate the whole sciatic nerve of an animal and it didn't have an olive bulk in it? So Rabbi Yehuda says, you're not chayav until you eat an olive bulk. It's a prohibition of eating, and eating needs a kezayit, a requisite amount. The rabbis say, no, it's a whole unit. So if you ate a complete sciatic nerve, it's called a bria. It's its own unique independent entity. You ate a whole sciatic nerve, so you're going to be obligated even if it's not an olive bulk. So let's say you ate these two. Now let's go back to our case. 2 gidim from 2 yerecha, from 2 thighs, from 2 animals, right? So you ate the gid and asher, 2 of them. But there wasn't a kezayit in each of them. So the rabbis say, look, you ate a whole one and a whole one, you're going to be liable 80. Okay, this is bezeh charzeh, so it has nothing to do with our case. You ate one, you were warned, you ate one. Warned, ate one. So Rabbi Yehuda says, we'll put the 2 together, and all together now you have a kezayit. You'll get 40 lashes. But you're not going to get for each one. And then it has absolutely nothing to do with what we were looking for, and which is, if you did it bevat achad, with one warning, and therefore we end up with no proof for Rav Yosef. And with that, we move on to the next Mishna. Now we get to the question you've all been asking, which is, how do you do this? Okay, I go to the butcher? How do I know? Right, I go to buy an animal. Okay, let's say not nowadays. I go to the butcher and I get it already slaughtered, but I go and I buy an animal to slaughter. Okay, I go to, let's say, I guess more the shuk, and I'm buying animals, and I want to know, right? Whose responsibility is it? My responsibility to ask? Did you sell the mother? How do I know? How do I figure out that I'm not transgressing Otovat B'no anytime I slaughter an animal? So the Mishna says, Ba'arba'a prakim b'shana, hamocher behema l'chavero tzarich lehodi'o, ima macharti l'shchot, bita macharti l'shchot. There's only 4 times a year, okay, or there's 4 times a year. I shouldn't say only. There's 4 times a year where the responsibility of the seller is to say, and 4 times a year means 4 days, not like 4 time periods. 4 days a year when the responsibility is on the seller. Someone who sells an animal has to tell the person, I sold the mother for slaughter. Now remember, I'm just going to remind you, we've learned this in other Sukkot and Nezikin. People sell animals for slaughter, people sell animals for plowing. Only for slaughter. Okay, if you sold an animal for slaughter purposes, you have to tell the person, I also sold the mother today, or I also sold the son today. Only 4 times a year. Okay, what are these 4 times a year? Eluhen, Erev Yom Tov Acharon Shel Chag, Erev Shmini Atzeret, Erev Yom Tov Arishon Shel Pesach, okay, first day of Pesach, before Leil HaSeder, Erev Atzeret, the night before Shavuot, the day before Shavuot, and Erev Rosh Hashanah, the day before Rosh Hashanah. These are the 4 years that people all ate a lot of meat. And if on those days there was a lot of slaughtering going on, and therefore the seller has to tell you, listen, the assumption is that you're buying it, obviously, the slaughter today. Often you buy animals for slaughter. You're not planning on slaughtering them that day. But on those days, you're obviously, if you go to the store to buy, you're not buying stuff to keep for later and I'll slaughter this in a week or 2. You're obviously buying it to slaughter now, and therefore they have to tell you. The seller, responsibility is on the seller, which means also that you don't have to ask. Okay? If you didn't ask and they didn't say, then you can assume that it's fine, because the burden of responsibility is on the seller. Okay, so there's a few questions to ask. Why Shmini Atzeret? What's missing? Okay, I think that's even more interesting. First day of Sukkot is missing. So the commentators try to say, Shmini Atzeret, it's a day that it's like the last day of all the Chagim. There's all these midrashim about it. It's a special relationship between God and, God is sad before he leaves his people after the holidays, and it's a special holiday. That's why people would eat more meat. What about the first day of Sukkot, though? It seems a little bit strange. Some people say that they were so busy building their sukkahs that they didn't have time to be slaughtering their animals and making meat. Okay, Shuli's article in Flashback this week Shuli Mishkan is all about meat eating in those days, and that the way we eat meat today is definitely not the way they ate meat in those days. I mean, not all of us, some of us don't eat meat at all. I think there's also been used to be, when I was growing up, everyone was eating meat all the time. Now it's definitely changed. And then in those days, this shows they didn't really eat a lot of meat. It was some times of year that they ate meat. She also quotes all sorts of other sources about showing, and some we saw in our Masechet, showing that meat wasn't so prevalent, meat eating. And Debbie, you're writing about it. I forgot to mention that. Obviously, Shavuot, you see this whole custom of eating dairy on Shavuot was not a thing then. Okay. So a lot of interesting things about it. But the most interesting thing is what's missing in the Mishnah. Forget about what's missing, what days are missing, like first day of Sukkot. But what's missing is what happens on the other days of the year. Okay? So it's obvious that the other days of the year, the seller doesn't have to say anything. And by the way, when it says the seller has to tell me, let's say the seller didn't tell me and then I find out. I can return the animal and say, listen, I don't want this animal because you sold the mother today and then I can't slaughter this. So you can go back and claim what we call a mekach ta'ut. This was a mistake in sale and force them to give you your money back. But what's interesting is it doesn't say what happens on the rest of the year. So why is it interesting? Because the Ramban and the Rashba have a disagreement. The Ramban says, okay, it says on those days the seller has to. So on the other days, it must be the buyer's responsibility is to ask, okay? Which is a little strange the Mishnah doesn't tell you that. You would think they would specify, you have to ask. So the Rashba actually says the complete opposite. The Rashba says on other days of the year, you don't even have to ask. The only concern is for those 4 days. On any other day of the year, you can assume it's a suffix. You can say, maybe it doesn't have a mother that's alive anymore. Maybe if it did, it wasn't sold. Maybe if it was sold, maybe they're not slaughtering it today. And there's so many sfeikot, it's so unlikely that this is going to happen. The Ramban, on the other hand, says, what are you talking about? You're slaughtering an animal. You could potentially transgress a Torah prohibition. Of course you have to ask. So that's a fascinating question. Okay? I'm not getting into halacha l'maaseh, but I did mention that in Sugya B'Ktana, she goes into, if your Hebrew's good, Rav Tabakana has a whole thing about the halacha l'maaseh, how this practically plays itself out in our day. By the way, I just realized that nowadays, if your Hebrew's not good, you can take the shiurim, put them into AI, and AI can probably summarize the shiur for you. So it's a good tip if you ever want to look at the Hebrew stuff on the site and Hebrew's not good. AI can do lots of amazing things, so you should try it and see if it works. Okay, now we're going to get going on the Mishnah. Amar Rabbi Yehuda. One more. Uchidivre Rabbi Yosef Glili. Now Rabbi Yosef Glili adds Af Erev Yom Kippurim Begalil. On Erev Yom Kippur in the Galilee. Okay, it's good. We're on Erev Tisha B'Av, and in terms of eating before a fast. Erev Yom Kippur in the Galilee, they would eat meat. Okay, not everybody eats meat before the fast. They would eat meat before the fast, and therefore for them also is a big day of slaughtering. You have to remember also on Erev Yom Kippur, there's a mitzvah to eat. Okay, as opposed to, let's say, Erev Tisha B'Av. There's no mitzvah today to eat, but there's a special mitzvah learned out from the Torah specifically on the 9th day to eat food and make festive meal even. Okay, so they would do that also on Erev Yom Kippur. Amar Rabbi Yehuda. Wait, when is this true that they have to tell you? Bisman she'en lo revach. If there's no interval. Aval yesh lo revach, ein tzarich lehodio. There's a lot of different interpretations of what this means. I'll go with Rashi, who says if, for example, you sold it the day before Erev Rosh Hashanah, and then you sell the next person the day of Erev Rosh Hashanah, then you don't have to tell them because you can assume the person who bought the day before already slaughtered it, which is interesting because you wouldn't necessarily assume that, but that's the way they explain. That's the way Rashi explains it. Umoder Rabbi Yehuda b'mocher ta'em l'chatan ve'et habat l'kala shetzarich lehodio. This is funny. Not funny, but you get an in into their world. If you sell the mother to the side of the groom, and then you sell the daughter animal to the side of the bride, you have to tell them b'yadua sheshem shochatim b'yom echad. Right? They would do self-catered weddings, right? Which nowadays is much less common. right? They would self-cater their weddings, and the bride's family would bring food, and the groom's family would bring food. So if you're selling to a bride and a groom, by the way, if you remember, we saw those stories where they go to the butcher shop to buy stuff for the son's wedding, another proof that they weren't always in the butcher shop. They weren't always buying meat, only on special occasions. So anyway, what do you see? That if you sell to both of them, you have to assume they're selling on the same day. So this is another exception to the rule where you would have to tell the family that, I sold the other side, the mother. Now, another halacha that's really not connected, but because we're talking about these 4 days of the year, there's another thing that happens on these 4 days of the year. This is a kind of protection for the buyers that, you know what it's like on Erev 3-day holiday, right? In the butcher shop, and there's a run for all the meat, and they're going to run out of meat, and if you don't go early, you're not going to get your meat. So if you prepay for your meat, okay, then let's say you get there and the butcher's like, sorry, all out of meat, but he has another animal and he can shecht it. Okay, this isn't like nowadays we go into a butcher shop, they're not slaughtering there. But you go to buy it and he has another animal, but he doesn't want to slaughter it because it's a whole animal. You're going to take a slab of the meat and the rest of it's going to go to waste. They didn't have refrigeration. Well, guess what? Afilu shor shaveh 1,000 dinarim ve'en lelokech ela dinar kofin oto lishchot. Okay, first of all, I didn't explain the words. Mashchitim et tabach ba'al korcho means we force the tabach to slaughter the meat, even if it's a super expensive animal, and I only paid 1 dinar out of the 1,000 dinars that whole animal cost. Still, we force him to slaughter that animal and give me my meat because I paid for it already. Okay, now this might sound strange because we know in halacha, paying doesn't do anything. Remember, meshicha is konot. We learned all that stuff way back in Kiddushin. We talked about kinyanim and in the Bavas about buying things, acquiring is with meshicha. I didn't pull the meat yet, obviously. So what are we talking about here? We're going to have to get back to this. Ve'en lelokech ela dinar. If the lokech only has a dinar, kofin oto. Okay, that was the right. So even if the lokech only paid a dinar, still we can force him to slaughter. Lifichach, but this has other ramifications. It might, this sounded good for me because I prepaid. I'm guaranteed I'm going to get my meat. However, mate, if the animal that I was promised to get meat from dies, well, mate la lokech. This all goes back to what we learned in Nezikin about money and who's responsible. It's mine and not the butcher's at this point, okay? Or the slaughterers, because I already acquired it, and if it dies, well, I lose, and not them. Aval b'shar yom Hashanah, okay, but any other day of the year, it's not like this. It's the opposite. If I paid money prepaid, I can't force you to give me meat, okay? And therefore, mate la mochel. And if I prepaid you and you say, oh, sorry, my animal died, tough luck. You still have to give me the meat because I didn't acquire it yet. It was in your domain. In your domain, it died, not mine. Okay, we're going to get into this a little more in the Gemara and see exactly how this works, this differentiation between the two cases. So don't worry if you didn't get it all yet because they didn't explain it. So now the Gemara starts off with a braita. Tana im hodio, im lo hodio. Now what if they didn't tell you anything, and this I already kind of told you, but if they didn't tell you anything when you went shopping on one of those 4 days, I can just slaughter without any worry. Not my problem. Okay, it doesn't really say what happens if it really is otovet b'no, but the point is you're not considered responsible because you had no way of knowing, and it's not my responsibility to go and ask. If they didn't tell me anything, I'm good. I'm a Rabbi Yehuda, ematai. So now we went, they're really not focused on that line. They're focused on the line about the parah to the chatan and the binah to the bitah to the daughter, to the kala. So lama limitne et ha'em lechatan ve'et habat lekala. Why did they specifically say the parah, right, the mother to the chatan side and the daughter to the kala's side? Okay, if I ask you who's more responsible to pay for a wedding these days, right? Most people will say nowadays it's a little more equal, but if it was going to side anywhere, it's usually the bride's side. Okay, if there's someone who's going to pay more or be more involved, it's the bride's side. Well, guess what? We're going to learn something here. In the time of the Gemara was not the case. Why did they say the aim l'chatan and the bat l'kala? Obviously, the aim is much bigger. The smaller one, right? The offspring is going to be smaller. So, milta agav orchi kamashval, and they wanted to teach you something, by the way, about the way things worked in those days, why they want to teach you this. I'll tell you why they want to teach you it, but okay. When they did the self-catering, the husband's side, the groom's side, would spend more than the bride's side. Okay, now, why are they telling us? Well, for us, it's just interesting to see. But they're telling you this because this has ramifications. What if you're getting married, right? Nowadays, same thing, right? You're going to go by what the standard is. If you're having a bit of a disagreement with the sides, who's supposed to pay more, then you go by what the standards are in your community. So that's why they're saying this was there to say what the standards are. Okay, it was often the groom's side that paid for the wedding. Okay, so I agree with your question, Tina. I was thinking about it as I was saying it. That why do we assume the mother's larger? Because theoretically they could both be adults. We all know kids that are, taller, like my kids are taller than me. That happens. But I assume they just mean more that, first of all, I think probably it's harder. By the time they're older, they're probably much more separated, and you wouldn't even know the mother and the child are together. So that's why I'm guessing they're assuming it's like that. But it could be not the case. But let's say more of the cases are like that than not. Okay, moving on. Now we're going to get to the whole thing about the last part of the Mishna that wasn't so clear. How could I have acquired by just prepaying when I didn't do meshicha? Meshicha is what's konot, by pulling it. I didn't pull the animal. So how could we possibly say it's mine that I could force them to sell it to me? And if it dies, it's my loss. Amar Rav Huna Amar Rav, Kisha Mashach. So Rav Huna says it must be, in the name of Rav, it must be I did do meshicha. So the Gemara says that can't possibly be. Because again, there's two cases to compare. One is on all the days, those 4 days, and the other is all the rest of the days of the year. Now, all the rest of the days of the year I wasn't koneh. So if it was mashach, in the case number 1, it's going to be mashach in case number 2, and then why wasn't I koneh? Why didn't I acquire it? So that's what they're going to say now. Yihachi Yamasefa, look at the end. Aval b'shar yemot Hashanah ain't okay, but the other days of the year it's not like that. It's the seller's responsibility. V'hamashach, but if I pulled it already, then it's mine. So that can't be. So now we're going to have a different answer. Amar Rabbi Shmuel bar Rav Yitzchak lo'olam shelo mashach ukigon shezikalo al yedei acher. What happened here? I paid, and the butcher said to some random person in the store, I want you to acquire this on behalf of Michelle. I wasn't there anymore. I left, and they said, listen, I'm going to give you rights to this on behalf of Michelle, and they did an act of acquiring for me. You can do that. Anyone can do that for you, as long as it's in your best interest. So now they're going to say the following. That's what we call zachin la'adam shelo b'fanav. We do something good for someone if they're not there. So we can assume they're going to appreciate it and want it to happen, and therefore it's as if it's with my agreement, my consent. But ein chavin la'adam shelo b'fanav. But you can't do something that's going to be bad in not in someone's interest if they're not there. So that's going to be the distinction between the two cases. So they did in both cases, they gave rights to someone else to acquire it on my behalf. And I wasn't there and I wasn't involved. On those 4 days, it's good for me because I know they're going to run out of meat, and it's obviously in my best interest to get some piece of meat that's already in my responsibility, even though I might take a loss if something happens to that animal, but it's still better for me because I'd rather, right? Again, just imagine yourself on Erev Chag, whether it's the bakery and trying to get your challahs, or the meat and trying to get your meat, or whatever it might be, if it's Shavuot and all the dairy stuff. I mean, in Israel, it's a little more pronounced and problematic than outside of Israel, but where, everyone's celebrating the same holiday, so, there's no cheese to be had, or there's no whatever. So, it's a zchut, it's a zachin la'adam shelo b'fanav. B'shar yemot Hashanah, but on other days of the year, dechofu lo, I don't want to take responsibility until I get it, because what if something happens to it? What if it gets ruined? What if as he's shechting it, he makes it an avela? I don't want that responsibility on my head. I want to be able to go to the butcher when I get there and get my meat. So, en chavin ladam shelo b'fanav. So, on any other day of the year, it's not good for me. Rabbi Elazar, okay, that's one answer. A different answer is Rabbi Elazar, Rabbi Yochanan, ba'arba'a prakim elu ha'emidu chachamim divreihem al din Torah. We revert back to the Torah rules. Okay, now this is what we're going to remember. If you don't remember it or you didn't learn it, Amar Rabbi Yochanan. Okay, what did I tell you before? Only meshicha is konot, not money. If I put money down, that doesn't mean I acquired it. Okay, it's counterintuitive to what we would think, right? I pay the money, isn't that mine? No, not until I pull the item. But Rabbi Yochanan said, actually, by strict Torah law, ma'oder konot, the money is what acquires things. Umatam amu meshicha konah. Why did they say only meshicha though? In other words, they went against Torah law and changed it and said, you know what, money doesn't buy. Meshicha, they wanted to protect buyers. What's the issue? Let's say I buy wheat from you. And then I pay you the money up front, and you don't give them to me yet. And I get them, I come back a week later, and you say, oh, sorry, but they burned in my attic. It's not in my best interest to acquire them before they're mine, because if you have a fire in your attic, and you're the seller, and you already sold it to me, and it's already mine, and it's not your responsibility, so you'll just say, okay, well, they'll burn in my attic. I'm not going to bother trying to save them. And I don't even know they're burning in your attic to think to save them. So basically, it doesn't protect me as a buyer, because you can easily claim, listen, they were burned, and sorry, not my fault, and that's a problem. So because of that, they said it's going to be meshicha. But on these 4 days a year to protect the buyers, that they get their meat for holidays, then they switched it, and they said, we're going to revert back to the Torah law for these 4 days. And that explains the distinction between the two. So we have two answers, either zicha, and then it would be zachin la'adam shelo b'fanav and ein chavin, and that would be the difference between the two cases, or this issue. Okay, finishing up our chapter now. Yom echad ha'amor, okay, we're in a new Mishna. Yom echad ha'amor bo'tova b'no, hayom olech achar halayla. This is another important question you have to know. What does it mean day? B'yom echad. Lo tishchatu b'yom echad. So yom echad means, we learn it, night goes after the day, so it starts from the night before, goes to the day like any Jewish day. Et zo darash Rabbi Shimon ben Zoma. But how did he get here? He made a drasha. Yom echad ha'amor b'maaseh b'reishit. Ne'amar b'maaseh b'reishit yom echad. V'ne'amar v'oto b'no yom echad. Now he's comparing it to the creation. Creation, yom, right? Vayerev vayiboker yom echad. There it says yom echad. Here it says b'yom echad. So just like there, ma yom ha'amor b'maaseh b'reishit hayom olech achar halayla, right? Vayerev vayiboker. That's where we get the whole thing from. That the night starts. The day starts at night. So, af yom echad ha'amor bo'to v'peno yom olech achar halayla. So same thing here. Now the Gemara is going to bring a bright as to why would you think otherwise? I mean, every Jewish day follows the night. Why do we need a drasha? Tanu Rabbanan. It's zo darash Rabbi Shimon ben Zoma. And he starts off this time in this bright, this version with a little bit of background. Lefisha kol ha'inyan kulo ino medaber ela b'kodashim. Really, the context here is sacrifices. Now, not exactly, but remember, we started out by saying the Pesach before is all about sacrifices. 7th day, and then, 7 days it'll be with his mother. Then, the 8th day, you can bring the sacrifice, and then it says, Otov Epino. So since in the context of sacrifices, you might think, now remember, the day of sacrifices starts in the morning and ends at night. Things that happen at night are like finishing up things from the day. And then the new day starts in the morning. So in sacrifices, it's different. The day starts in the morning. So, the night follows the day rather than the day following the night. So, you might have thought then day here might mean sacrificial day, or a temple day. That's what we darshan from Maaseh Bereshit. Ma yom echad amor Maaseh Bereshit hayom olech achar halayla, af yom amor bo'to b'no hayom olech achar halayla. So from there we get that it follows the day follows the night. Rebbe Omer, he has a different drasha. We're now on Amud Bet. Yom echad, yom hamiyuchad. He says yom echad is a reference to the fact that there's special days. And he uses this to darshan the halacha from the previous Mishnah. Ta'un karuz. The Yom HaMiyuchad on the unique day, which is unique days, 4 of them, you need to announce, meaning the seller needs to announce. Mikan amru ba'arba'a prakim b'shana mocher be'im ala chaverot tzarich lahodio. And from there they learn that the seller has to tell you in the previous halacha. With that, Hadran Alachot Tovet B'no, we finish our chapter. Before we go on, I just want to point out one interesting thing. First of all, it's interesting that it ends in this kind of a Gadic way almost, by comparing Otovet B'no to Maaseh Bereshit, and I thought maybe it could go back to, and you could think about developing an idea. It's not fully developed in my head yet, but this idea of comparing creation and the Otovet B'no to creation, and that maybe this goes back to the reasons we were talking about for the mitzvah of, to not be achzari, right, cruelty, and to also, right, whether it's either it's actual cruelty or it's just teaching us the trait of cruelty, and that's a bad trait. it almost sounds similar to the idea of Maaseh Breshit. In other words, this is part of being like God, okay? That we have to act like God and have our traits like God and be sympathetic. And, maybe there's some idea here that they're connecting it to Maaseh Breshit. And maybe doing this is kind of counter to Maaseh Breshit, if you would kill Otovet. But no, that's, it's also, by the way, we're talking about slaughtering and killing beings, and Maaseh Breshit is the creation of beings. So anyway, it's an interesting food for thought. Okay, next chapter. Now we're on the new topic. Every chapter is going to be another topic. Kisoi Hadam. Now we're going to talk about covering the blood. Also in Hebrew, Rav Tubakan has a shir on the background and all the details of Kisoi Adam, covering the blood. Noheg, so Kisoi Adam, let's just read the pasuk. Ish mi b'nei Yisrael u'min hager hagar b'tocham. Okay, a person from b'nei Yisrael and hager hagar b'tocham, and any other people living among them. Asher, right, a ger, a convert. Asher yatsud, seid chaya o of, who hunts. Okay, the Mishna is going to already say, it's not only if you hunt, okay? It sounds like, what if it's just in your farm and you kill it, okay? You slaughter it. But no, they're saying only if you, right, the Pesach says hunting, but we're going to see it's even if not hunting. Chaya o of. Chaya o of, notice, who's missing? Behema. This is not relevant for behemot, only for chayot, undomesticated animals, and birds. Asher yeachel, that you will eat. V'shafach damo, you spill the blood, v'kisau ba'afal, and cover it with earth. Okay, let's get to the halacha now. Let's get to the Mishna. Kisui adam noheg ba'aretz u'b'chutz la'aretz. Okay, this is in Israel, outside of Israel, b'fnei abayit v'shalo b'fnei abayit, when there's a temple, even when there's not a temple. B'chulin aval lo b'mukdashim. Only in chulin, not mukdashim. Now, what kind of mukdashim are we talking about? We assume we're talking about bird sacrifices, because not animal sacrifices. So we assume right now we're talking about bird sacrifices, and we're going to deal with that today. Is that really what it's talking about? V'noheg b'chayav ba'of, only in undomesticated animals and birds, not in behemot. U'bizuman, remember the difference, right? The sheep, the cattle, all that is in the behemot category. No mitzvah of kisoi adam there. B'mizuman v'she'enu mizuman. Enu mizuman is you have to hunt it, you have to go find it. Mizuman is it's living in your house. Again, not in your house proper, but in your grounds of your house. V'noheg b'koi mipnei shu safek. And even a koi, which is a safek, we learned a lot about that. Okay, which again, there were two opinions that it wasn't a safek, but we're dealing with those who think it's safek. Either it's a kilayim animal, it's a mixed breed, or it's just a breed that we just don't know where to categorize it. It's also, you have to cover the blood because it's a safek, because maybe it's a chaya. However, which we already learned this, ain't shochatin oto b'yom tov. But you can't slaughter it on Yom Tov, because if you slaughter it, you're going to have to cover the blood. And if you're not obligated to cover the blood, then you can't cover the blood on Yom Tov, right? You can slaughter on Yom Tov, and you can do things that connect with the slaughter, but if it's a safek here, because maybe it's an animal and doesn't eat kisui adam, you're not going to be able to cover the blood. So you should avoid slaughtering a koi on Yom Tov. But if you did slaughter it, you don't have to cover the blood. Okay, so now the Gemara is going to start off with their big question, and we won't finish it today. Mukdashim, my time alone. Why not in Mukdashim? Ilema mishum de Rabbi Zera. So again, we're talking about a bird. Let's just remember what happens with a bird. You stand either at the top or at the bottom, depending on chatat. Then you're going to put the blood on the altar. Okay, you're going to kind of squeeze it on, depending on which one. They each have a bit of a different way of doing it, but basically you're going to squeeze it onto the altar. So now the point is you're going to have to cover it on the altar. Okay, so let's just talk about this. Maybe it's because of what Rabbi Zera said. I'm a Rabbi Zera. Okay, now right now, until now, we think covering the blood means covering the blood, putting earth on top of the blood. But Rabbi Zera said, earth underneath and earth above. Okay, you have to cover it both below and above. Shenamar, where does he get it from? Now, afar lo ne'emar ela be'afal. You could have said v'kisau afal, cover it with earth. But the be'afar, okay, it's not like probably you would say be'afar anyway, but theoretically you could do it without the bet. Be'afar means in earth, which means in earth means earth surrounding it, both below and above. Milamed shashochet tzarich shiten afar milamata u'va'afar lamala. Now, so what does that have to do with anything? If you have to put earth below, hachalo efsha. You can't. In other words, theoretically on the Mizbeach, you could put earth on top of it, the blood. But you can't put earth below. Why not? Well, we'll see. How are you going to do it? Leitivili batle, you could put it there and say, I'm making this nullified and it will just become part of the Mizbeach. Well, that's a problem. Kamosif abinyan, you're adding to the Mizbeach. The Mizbeach has very particular dimensions. You add more, you're adding more height to the Mizbeach. Uktiv, and it says, it's all written and it's done exactly as it's written. It's Pesach in Chronicles, but it says, right, everything is done according to the blueprints. It wasn't in the blueprints to add some more earth to the Mizbeach. Loli bale, if you don't nullify it to the Mizbeach, now we're going to understand why they said nullify it to the Mizbeach. If you don't nullify it to the Mizbeach and say, oh, this is just part of the Mizbeach, well, if you don't do that, well, the blood has to go on the altar. If you have earth in between that's not part of the Mizbeach, right, which can't be part of the Mizbeach in option 1, but in option 2 would be, well, there's dirt that's not part of the Mizbeach, but then there's a chatzitza, there's an interposition between the blood and the Mizbeach, and the blood has to go directly on the Mizbeach. So maybe it's because of Rabbi Zera who says you need the blood underneath, the earth underneath, and you can't do that in any way. So then they say, wait, he says, wait, okay, so you can't do the bottom, but maybe you should just cover it in the top. And what we're going to see in a minute, Milo Tanya, does it not say in a Braita that if you can't do it in the bottom, you can at least do it at the top, and post facto, it's okay. In other words, it's not the ideal, but if you can't put the earth underneath, then you do still cover the blood. So why don't we say that in sacrifices, that's what you do. So you don't need to do underneath. You can't do underneath. So fine. So in this case, just do it above. Now, how do we know that you could b'di'evet, that if you have no choice, you can just do it above? Rabbi Yosef omer, shachat chaya, v'achar kach shachat be'ema. What if you slaughtered a chaya first, which you're obligating kisvei? Then you slaughter a be'ema after that. Patur milechasot. Okay, you're exempt here from covering because if you put the earth on top, there's no way it's going to cover the blood of the chaya because it's already covered by the blood of the animal. Okay, so behema avachar chaya. This is the case that's important for us. If you have a behema first and then a chaya, so now you can't put earth underneath a chaya because it's already on the blood of the behema. Chayav lechasot, you still have to cover it. So what do you see here? That even if you can't put the soil on the bottom, the earth on the bottom, you should still put the earth on the top. So they answer no, that you can't compare that case and say that's going to be the same as us because it's very different. Kid Rabbi Zera, Da'amar Rabbi Zera, Kol ha'ra'oi lebila ein bila ma'akevet bo. B'chol she'ein ra'oi lebila bila ma'akevet bo. First of all, I want to point out in the beginning we said maybe it's like Rabbi Zera, who says you need it in the bottom and the top, and now this is also like Rabbi Zera, who says, completely different context, if you can mix it, remember with the mincha, then even if you didn't mix it, it's fine. But if it's too much in the bowl, right? If you have too much that you can't actually mix it, then you have to mix it. In other words, you can't say, oh, it's okay that I didn't mix it. So now how does this work? This means if something could potentially happen, then we can live without it. So in the case of the be'ema and the chaya, potentially you could have put the blood, the soil, the earth underneath. But you didn't, so it's okay. In our case, you can't do it. If you can't do it, then you have to do it, right? You can't say, oh, well, we'll get away without doing it. No. You have to have the potential to be able to do it, and that's why we're going to be exempt in the temple, because there's no option to put the soil, the earth underneath. So that's why we're going to basically say there's no mitzvah in the temple because it can't possibly be done. To which the Gemara says, what do you mean? Of course it can be done. Okay, you can't put it underneath the blood before it goes on the altar. I get that. But you could scrape it off and then cover it. After you sprinkle the blood on the mizbech, scrape it off the mizbech and then cover it. Milo Tznan, does it not say in the Mishna, which we'll see later, Damanitaz v'sha'ala sakin chayav l'chasot. Blood that's, let's say, what do? You're going to slaughter, so you put the earth underneath and you slaughter and the blood falls on the earth and then you cover it with more. But what if it sprays far off the blood? Or what if there's blood still on the knife? Now, does all the blood need to be covered? So it seems like it does. So what does it say? Chayav l'chasot. Now, how are you going to cover the blood that, is far off? You're going to scrape it off wherever it is and bring it over where you put already the earth. And the one on the knife, you're not going to bury the whole knife. You're going to take it, scrape it off the knife. So, alma de garir umachasele, right? You can obviously scrape the blood off and cover it. So why don't you do that? Hachanami nigro v'nechasele. We should do that with the temple. To which they answer, you know what? You're right. Ibakachem mizbeach hachanami. When it said lo b'mukdashim, it didn't mean bird sacrifices like we thought. Okay, bird sacrifices, really, you can cover the blood. Okay, because you can scrape it off the mizbeach and cover them. So hacha b'mayaskina, what must we be talking about? Bekadshe beta kabayit. We must be talking about a bird that you designated for temple use, not for sacrificing. That animal can't be slaughtered because it can't be slaughtered to eat because you're not allowed to eat it because it's sanctified and it's isur me'ila, right? It would be misuse of consecrated property. So because of that, it's a shchita she'ena ru'uya. Remember, we learned that it's not a valid slaughter. Since it's not a valid slaughter, you're not going to be obligated to cover the blood because it's not part of, right? You're only obligated when you actually slaughter the animal. This would be an improper slaughter, and therefore you're not obligated. So right now, at this stage, they think that when the word says mukdashim, they're talking about beta kabayit, but there's a lot more of this sugya you're going to see going forward, and you'll see where the sugya ends in tomorrow's daf. So what did we see today? We finished up with trying to prove Rav Yosef, who said that Sumchos would agree even when there's not gufim muchlakim, two separate units, but it's like two pieces of chelev and other similar cases like two gira nashez and all that. Tried to prove that we see that he would say 80. We found all these cases where there were cases similar that were 80, but in the end we said they could be explained in other ways and we really can't prove anything. So after having 3 attempts, the third one was today, we reject this. We can't prove it. Then we got to how do you deal with a tovet beno in the marketplace? Whose responsibility is it? On 4 days a year, it's the responsibility of the seller to say, I sold on the same day. But the other days of the year, it didn't say what's supposed to happen, and Machloket Ramban and Rashba, whether the seller, the buyer has to ask, or you could just assume no, there's no issue, okay, and not worry about anything at all. Okay, from there we had that cute thing about the Chatan and Kalan, about who's more responsible for the wedding. It's the groom's side for the food. And then we had this Yom Echad, the day follows the night. Right? Oh, we had the side thing about the kinyan. On the 4 days of the year, there was another difference about if you prepaid, you would actually acquire it, right? The rights to it. And then we had the why that's different than during the year, either ma'ot konot, or maybe it's only if they did a zikoy and they were mizaka someone for you. Okay, and then we had the night follows the day, just like in Maaseh Bereshit, and then we started with Kisoy Adam, and the main thing we focused on was this, right? Number one, it's only chayot and ofot, not behemot, and we had the whole din of the koi, and then we said it's not in mukdashim, which right now at this stage of the sugya, we're saying actually it is in bird sacrifices, it's just not in birds that were designated for temple use, and because they're forbidden to benefit from, and therefore it's not really a shchita, and therefore, right, whereas shchita in the temple, right, it's malika actually, but it is a proper shchita, right, but here it's not a proper shchita because you're not allowed to use them for your own purposes, and therefore you can't benefit from them, and therefore it's not shchita, and therefore you don't have to cover the blood. But we'll see where the sugya goes, and we'll end here for today, wishing everyone a good day and a meaningful fast, and we'll meet up on Friday in Zoom, and like I said, the shiur for tomorrow will go up in a few minutes.